Hey everyone, my name is Jose and today I want to talk to you about AI scene detection on smartphone cameras. So let's get started. Depending on what smartphones you have used before, you might know about AI scene detection or may have never heard of it before. AI scene detection is a feature on some smartphone brands such as Huawei, Oppo, Xiaomi, Vivo, Realme, Redmi, just to name a few out there. And it's supposed to make your photo better by recognizing what your camera is about to capture. So if you're taking a photo of a flower, your phone recognizes that it's a flower and it makes adjustments to the photo so that the flower looks better. AI scene detection can recognize a lot of different scenes, but my question to you is, does AI scene detection make any meaningful adjustments that it truly enhances the photo to be better? I'll start off where AI scene detection really took off, which was back in 2017 with the Huawei Mate 10. The Mate 10 was hyped up about how it can recognize 13 scenes at launch and was later updated so that it can recognize 19 different scenes. This ranges from the sky to plants to text print, pets, and such. And overall, it was very impressive of the phone to be capable of doing this. You might think that recognizing 13 or 19 different scenes is maybe not that impressive or is a low amount, but the reason behind that is that they are generalized categories and are not really that super specific. So something that will pop up often on an AI scene detecting camera is something like the sky, because a lot of our photos are taken outside, and since the sky is generally the same with the only difference being how blue or dull the sky is, the AI will make adjustments that are right for that time. But there are more specific scenes out there, like a dog, because not all dog breeds look the same since they have different fur colors and such. So this one is not that generalized like how the sky usually is. Even so, the Mate 10 would still recognize the dog as a scene, and it would make whatever adjustments it can to make the photo look better. The process behind recognizing a scene and making those adjustments relies on the neural processing unit of a phone and the image database that the phone was trained to recognize scenes. So a neural processing unit, or NPU, is a chip designed to process data relating to neural networks, which something like a CPU or GPU can't do as efficiently as an NPU. The way I see NPUs is that they are designed to solve problems that involve interpretation rather than a mathematical solution that CPUs and GPUs can easily do. So if you wanted to know what 9 plus 10 is, a CPU or GPU can tell you the answer because the answer can be solved through a mathematical process that is a more direct approach. But if you wanted a computer to tell you what subject this picture is about, it's not a simple 2 plus 2 question because the answer involves interpretation. So the Mate 10 was the first Huawei phone to have an NPU built into the chip, which it had a Kirin 970, with the other Kirin chips not having an NPU, so it would have been difficult to include AI scene detection without having an NPU. Fast forward to today, almost every phone chip has an NPU, whether you have a low-end phone or a high-end phone. Pretty much these phones have an NPU built into the chip. Now, an NPU can be used beyond AI scene detection. So let's take the Google Lens app for example. If you wanted to copy and paste text from a real-life document in front of you, you just take a photo of it where that photo goes to a Google data center where a TPU is used, which is essentially very similar to an NPU, and it sends back the data to your phone so that you can copy and paste the text from that photo. Although the Google Lens app doesn't use your phone's NPU for this processing, Apple's Siri voice assistant uses the iPhone's NPU to recognize your speech, and it doesn't need to send that voice data to a data center in order to process those commands. There's also other examples for phone NPUs, such as if you're on a phone call and the wind is blowing, the NPU will try to reduce that wind noise so that your speech is clear. But yeah, NPUs are used all the time without us even knowing. Now here's where the video needs to make a sudden left turn, because this part of the video was supposed to be about the marketing behind AI scene detection for phones, but then I made a shocking discovery, so let's talk about it. So I thought that Huawei and Xiaomi and other phones avidly advertise their phones to be about AI scene detection, where they show you, oh, if you turn on AI scene detection, you can make your photos look better. But this sort of marketing doesn't really exist. In my time trying to find commercials about smartphones, I couldn't find many videos where the commercial showed you specifically about AI scene detection. This really baffled me because I swear this was a normal thing for companies to advertise, but that's not the case. So what I found out instead is that yes, smartphone companies do advertise their phones to be about AI, but they don't mention or specifically talk about AI scene detection. Generally, when a phone is advertised to have an AI camera, it's not about AI scene detection. It really is just a generalized term. So the Xiaomi Mi 11T Pro has an AI camera, but all of the advertising around the phone having an AI camera is about its video recording magic, where it makes your videos look better through the different effects and transitions it has. So they are advertising this phone that if you want to be a pro cinematographer, the Mi 11T Pro has an AI that makes video recording and editing easy. Yes, there's probably an AI functionality behind RedMagic, but all of the AI advertising is not about scene recognition at all. And I look at another AI-powered phone, which is the Xiaomi 12 phones. It has nothing to do with AI scene detection. Rather, it's about AI noise reduction for video. I don't know what AI has anything to do with noise reduction, but that's what's centered around this AI camera phone. What's interesting is that the specifications for the Xiaomi 12 and the Mi 11T Pro both include details about AI features for the phone, but they don't list about AI scene detection. Okay, now look at the Poco M4 Pro, which it says AI twice, one inside a camera ring and one off to the side. Okay, so does this phone advertise AI scene detection? Not at all. So I have come to find that AI advertising on a smartphone camera can mean a few things, but usually it's just three main things. First is AI HDR, where your phone detects that your photo would benefit from an HDR shot, so it shoots in HDR. You can just call it auto HDR, which it is auto HDR, but sure, AI HDR, whatever. Second is AI portrait shot, which is basically meaning that an AI is responsible for sensing the foreground and background in a portrait mode photo. Basically, any phone that has a portrait mode option has an AI responsible for detecting a foreground and background. It's pretty simple in theory, so this one is also just whatever. The third and final one is AI night mode, where your phone detects that your photo would benefit if night mode was to be used, and it switches to night mode automatically. So this one's really similar to auto HDR and AI HDR because it does it on its own accord. I haven't heard people use auto night mode as a term before. That probably exists as a term, but sure, whatever. I'm just gonna call this auto night mode because that's pretty much what it is. Honestly, this is really weird to see that it's not a popular thing to advertise your phone to have AI scene detection, where instead phones are just advertised to have an AI camera, which I find to be quite generic and buzzwordy of just saying your phone has an AI camera. You could call AI scene detection to be buzzwordy as well, but at least it's more specific than just saying your phone has an AI camera. It's also weird to see that Huawei, out of all companies, doesn't advertise their cameras to have AI scene detection, because when I think about AI scene detection overall, I think about how Huawei, in my opinion, does it best. It's also weird to see that something like the Poco phone doesn't advertise their phones to have AI scene detection, because if you think about it, if you advertise a cheap phone to have AI scene detection, you actually make that phone in a buzzwordy way sound like a more capable camera phone, because the AI is able to make adjustments to your photos in order to make them look better. It's an aspect of advertising that it just never gets touched. And I'm not sure why, because I think that it's a space that's premium where you can advertise this premium feature on something like a cheap Poco phone. But after all of this time, it turns out that the 2022 Oppo Find X5 Pro, which is a flagship phone, advertised AI scene detection. And even though it's just this one tiny section out of the entire website, round of applause to Oppo for at least aiding my search. So yeah, I find it really strange in a time like today where companies can shout out words like crypto and metaverse, that smartphone companies just don't shout out AI scene detection. My instant response to why companies don't shout out AI scene detection is because it's an outdated term by this time. It's not relevant anymore, because instead of using a buzzword like, hey, we have a AI scene detection, instead that has shifted focus to, hey, we have a 40 megapixel quad camera array. This honestly makes a lot of sense, because no one's gonna care about AI scene detection anymore if people are now focusing on more cameras and high megapixel camera counts, because they think those equal a good camera experience. This is probably the best answer as to why companies don't advertise AI scene detection anymore, and it's now about high megapixel camera counts rather than an AI camera functionality. My second response is that maybe people don't like AI scene detection and have it turned off all the time. In my opinion, this makes sense because AI scene detection, especially on cheap phones, makes pretty bad adjustments, and companies don't want to associate the AI scene detection on their expensive phones with the bad AI scene detection on the cheap phones. Either that, or AI scene detection is just a thing of the past that companies don't care about anymore. Even though I think that AI scene detection actually has a lot of potential, and here's why. First, let's assume that AI scene detection came on every smartphone, no matter if it cost $100 or $1,000. And yes, there are actually phones out there with AI scene detection for both expensive and cheap phones. Second, assume that AI scene detection was the main selling point of the phone, so that there is an emphasis that this AI feature is integral to the camera experience. And third, assume that AI scene detection was more expansive than it is today, so it can recognize more things. So keep this scenario in mind because I'm about to tell you why AI scene detection can be very useful. So if you have a cheap phone, chances are is that the AI scene detection either doesn't work, like on the TCL 10 SE, or it just downright sucks, like on the Poco X3 Pro. AI scene detection is about making photos better through adjustments, but some cheaper phones have bad AI that don't enhance the photo to be better. Nowadays, cheap smartphones have cheap sensors where they're not as good as more expensive phones, which have better sensors. But the thing is, the reason behind AI scene detection on cheap phones is to compensate for the bad and poorer camera experience. Even if the adjustments the AI makes are bad, there is potential for a good AI to make your photos look better. But the reason behind that there is no such thing as a good AI on a cheap phone is because that good AI experience is reserved for a more expensive phone where that experience is going to be more premium feeling, which is appropriate for any expensive phone because you expect everything on that phone to be good. So a good AI scene detection algorithm is seen on expensive phones where that expensive price tag gets you access to use the better developed AI scene detection. Remember when I said that AI on a cheap phone is to bring you up closer to a good camera experience that is seen on an expensive phone? So what does AI scene detection do for an already good and expensive camera phone? Well, AI scene detection on a flagship phone is supposed to further enhance your already good camera experience because the AI benefits from the better capability that come with better sensors on more expensive phones. So the better camera sensor can do things like show you more dynamic range, or the AI can utilize that extra dynamic range so that it can make the adjustments better. Because on a cheap phone with worse dynamic range, the AI adjustments it makes are just way too linear. What I mean by that is that cheap phones usually make the photo colors look the same, so there is no tonality or contrast in the photo, but more expensive phones with the better sensors can show you that shift in tonality. Thus, the AI adjustments it makes on an expensive phone can be gradual rather than the linear adjustments that are seen on cheap phones. Not only that, but remember that expensive phones have a better chip, thus they have a better NPU with their chipset. So that means that cheaper phones are going to have a worse performing NPU that are going to have a harder time detecting scenes. At this point, you should have a good idea about AI scene recognition and its purpose on cheap and expensive phones. So now it's time to actually go test out whether AI scene detection is any good or not. For this test, I will show you a side-by-side comparison with the default photo alongside the AI scene detected photo where the phone made adjustments. I'll be using the Xiaomi Poco X3 Pro, the OnePlus 8T, the RedMagic 6R, and the Huawei P30 Pro. First up, we have the Xiaomi Poco X3 Pro, which is a $250 phone, but it does have a flagship processor. So let's see if that flagship processor with that good NPU is utilized properly with AI scene detection. First scene is with the purple flowers, and the Poco correctly identified that this scene has flowers. The default photo is pretty good with a natural amount of saturation, But the AI photo is just way too bright and the saturation is a little bit higher, but not too much. But it does go pretty high. I don't really like that the photo is bright, so the default photo wins. Also, just like my previous video, I'll have to go over these photo comparisons really quickly because we actually have a lot more photos to go through this time, and we still have the other phones with the other comparisons to go through. So yeah, I actually have to go pretty quickly on this one too. The AI photo is also way too bright, so default wins. With Paul Revere, the phone identified the scene as a statue, which surprised me because I thought it was going to recognize the sky instead. I think this one is a tie because both photos look very similar, with the AI photo having a bit darker shadow on the statue to make it look more grand. Now this photo was recognized as a body of water, and it made adjustments to the entire scene that the whole photo has a blue filter. I really hate it when the Poco has AI scene adjustments like this, so default photo wins. Again, with the boat, I really hate it. It looks like a bad Instagram filter or something. This scene was a bit tricky because of how much different things you have going on here, but the AI picked up the grass and it made the whole photo have a bad filter. The default photo wins. The AI failed to detect this tree, so default wins under this condition. The AI wins as it detected the building and it made it a little bit sharper and applied a good amount of saturation. Again, with the AI detecting a body of water, it's very bad. I think this photo of the flowers is a tie because both look good, but the AI misidentified the flowers to be maple leaves instead. The grass is also a kind of a tie because I think the adjustments are questionable, and the AI failed to detect the tree. Now the Poco X3 Pro did a good job at recognizing scenes, but the AI scene adjustments it made were just really bad because most of the time it just made the photo really bright or questionably saturated or just applied a weird color filter across the entire photo, thus basically making these AI scene adjustments destructive. I consider this to be a failure for the Poco's AI because if it takes simple things like plants and greenery and the sky, it just makes it look super off. So that makes me think that this kind of enhancement isn't really an enhancement at all, just because of the completely different and new look your photos have. So it's a different kind of enhancing. Next is the OnePlus 8T, which doesn't explicitly have AI scene detection, but if you point at the sky or some greenery or something basic, a little icon will show at the bottom that it did recognize a scene. Despite this, the adjustments it makes are very minimal that it doesn't change the photo by a whole lot. In my opinion, the enhancements are so unnoticeable that I will be skipping this phone because the enhancements aren't really that meaningful. I'm not sure what's the point of having this feature if the adjustments aren't really that different, but yeah, the AT already has good camera quality, so the scene detection is probably doing some very minor lifting. Next is the RedMagic 6R, which is a gaming phone. So let's see if AI scene detection can improve the camera quality on a phone that is not centered about photography. The flower adjustments is similar to the Poco phone, but it's not that bright. It's just more saturated. Because it's not a destructive adjustment, the AI wins. However, the picture of the yellow flowers is a destructive adjustment because the colors don't look good, so the default wins. The AI recognized the sky and made the whole photo more saturated, which I do like more because it's punchy but also realistic enough. Although I recognized the sky, the whole photo has more saturation as seen with the rocks in the back. The AI wins with Paul Revere. The AI failed to recognize the boat or anything else, so default wins under this condition. Again, with the boat, the AI failed to recognize anything. The AI again failed here with the cannon. AI failed with the tree. The AI recognized the sky and made the photo more saturated, which now it looks super saturated, but it didn't cross my limit, so the AI wins here. The AI failed with the pond. The AI recognized the sky and just boosted saturation again. Still didn't cross my limit, so the AI wins. The AI boosted the grass to a weird color, but the sky does look better, so I think the AI wins. And the AI failed to recognize the tree. Overall, the AI on the 6R just sucks because all it knows how to do is just boost up the saturation, and it doesn't do anything else regarding to contrast or shadows, for example. If you have the RedMagic 6R, just turn off the AI because without the AI, the camera quality is already good. And if you want your photos to look more saturated, then just boost up the saturation manually on your already neutral looking photos. That way you have more control over how much saturation is now applied to your new photo. Last up, we have my personal favorite camera phone, which is also my personal device, the Huawei P30 Pro. Quick note that I do have a bias with the camera quality on the P30 Pro because I always have Master AI turned on. But even so, I'll still truthfully give my own thoughts about whether the photo benefited with Master AI turned off or on. Yeah, out of all the phones I tested, the P30 Pro is specifically a camera-centered phone, where the other phones I tested are not that focused on premium camera excellence. With the purple flowers, Master AI, like the rest, just saturated the photo, but I do think that Master AI did a good job. The photo of the flowers is slightly saturated, but better overall, so Master AI wins. Master AI detected the sky and just boosted only the sky, which leaves everything else in the photo the same saturation if you look at the rocks behind. Adjustments like these is what makes me think Master AI works better than other phone AIs, because at least Master AI knows how to make proper adjustments without affecting everything else in the photo. I was hoping for Master AI to detect the sand and water to think that the scene is a beach, but instead the sky was detected and the sky was boosted just by a little bit. Even though the sky is barely boosted, I consider this a win for Master AI. With the boat, Master AI detected the sand to be a beach and it gave the photo a lot more contrast. Although I don't like how the boat turned out, everything else in the photo turned out good, so Master AI wins. Master AI detected the greenery and made a slight adjustment, so it wins. Master AI detected the sky instead of the tree, but it still wins in my opinion. It detected the sky, and I still think Master AI wins. Another sky detection, Master AI wins. The flowers were detected, but it also made adjustments to the sky, and I think the AI photo looks pretty good. It almost reminds me of a photo an iPhone could take. The grass in this photo is saturated, but it's a good amount of correct saturation where the grass looks good, where other phones just make it look yellow or bright. The last photo of the tree is a tie because the AI made adjustments to contrast and it looks very similar overall. So yeah, the P30 Pro with its Master AI did not disappoint me, even though it has before. But in this round of testing, it played out pretty well, though I do think with some photos, the AI adjustments could have been just a little bit better. Now we are in the bonus round where I'm going to quickly show you the AI scene adjustments made by the phone, but instead I just put up the photos on my computer screen and let the phone recognize my screen as the scene, because it's kind of hard for me to test these environments in the real life way, because how am I supposed to go to the beach and in a snowy environment and then the mountain range all for this? I know this is California and stuff, but me going out and testing this is not really practical for the time being. I know putting a picture up on my computer screen and letting the phone do the recognition is not entirely scientific testing. I tried my best with this one, but what matters more is the adjustments that it makes so that I can give you the insight into what the potential final output would look in a real life perspective if I actually did go out and take out these photos for the selected scenes I'm about to do. I'm just gonna try to go pretty fast with this one because I don't really want to make this section too long, and I'm not gonna use the OnePlus 8T because the enhancements it makes weren't really that meaningful to begin with, so I'm not gonna test it here because it's practically gonna be the same thing, just to reduce time. The 6R made the entire scene more saturated, and not just the bicycle, which is typical for the 6R to do when it recognizes a scene. The P30 Pro only saturated the bicycle, and the Poco did not recognize the scene. Moving forward, if I don't name a phone, it means that the AI didn't recognize it. The Poco misidentified the breakfast to be flowers, but the scene does look better just with a cooler white balance. The 6R made the photo more saturated, and the P30 Pro changed how the greens look. From experience, Master AI never does a good job with green or brown colored food, and I think a real life photo of this would have reflected that. The Poco applied a blue filter across the entire photo, which somewhat works here. 6R saturated to a good amount. P30 Pro actually detected that the scene would be better off with an ultra-wide angle, so that's cool, because an ultra-wide angle means I could fit more of the city into my photo. Good job, Huawei. The Poco made the white balance warmer, which is appropriate for candles. The Poco applied the same typical blue filter onto the car. It somewhat works here, but it's still questionable. I'm also disappointed that the P30 Pro didn't detect the car. The Poco cat photo is okay, but just blue overall. The 6R photo saturated with the right amount. The P30 Pro also saturated the right amount on the cat. The Poco made the clouds whiter and colder, and so did the P30 Pro, just by a little bit. The Poco applied the bad blue filter to the dog. The 6R saturated and it looks good, but the P30 Pro didn't detect the dog, which I think the phone doesn't have a database for dogs. Poco again with the bad filter. 6R saturated and no detection from the P30 Pro. The Poco detected a night shot without going into night mode, so it must have done other adjustments. And the P30 Pro detected the fireworks and it adjusted the saturation for it. Poco applied the blue filter with the food. The P30 Pro probably would have done a good job here, but I bet those green colors would have still came bad. Poco did an okay job, and P30 Pro made the food more yellow than it is, which is typical for Master AI to do on brown colored food. Poco gave the building weird white balance, which might be the blue filter. And the P30 Pro recognized the scene as a historic building and made the reds more pronounced. Poco misidentified the mountains for a sunrise, which there is kind of a sunrise on the mountains, but it still worked. 6R correctly identified the mountains and it made it more saturated. P30 Pro detected the mountains and applied some saturation. This one is funny because the P30 Pro can detect pandas as a scene, which is oddly specific because it can't detect giraffes or elephants, for example. The Poco applied the blue filter for the snow, which makes sense, but something tells me that this would have gone bad in a real-life perspective. The P30 Pro did a similar thing, but at least to a much lesser extent. the P30 Pro detected a stage performance, and although it detected it correctly on this photo, the adjustments it makes aren't really that noticeable, which is weird because it worked before, and it usually involves more contrast and saturation from my experiences of using Master AI with stage performances. Poco made the sunset more saturated, so did the 6R, and so did the Huawei P30 Pro. Overall, the phones do a good job at recognizing the scenes. However, with the Poco, it just has this really bad blue filter that it can apply across a lot of different photos, and it's very destructive to the quality of the photos it takes. And with the 6R, all it knows how to do is just boost up the saturation if it detects the photo correctly. And it doesn't really do any other adjustment to like contrast or brightness, and just all it knows how to do is just boost up saturation. The only good contender here is the P30 Pro, where Master AI is mindful about changing the subject of the photo, where it only really changed the main subject of the photo without really making adjustments to anything else in the photo, whether it's in the foreground or background. Also, the Poco and the 6R both have AI camera marked on the camera bump of both respective phones. And yeah, it's a buzzword, of course, and I just find it funny that those phones have that buzzword while the P30 Pro doesn't have any marking that says AI camera. In my last video, I talked about computational photography in the sense that Adobe will be making a universal camera app that will allow you to take HDR photos across all phones. But now, I'm wondering, what if this Adobe camera app has AI scene detection? Is that even something to consider? My thoughts on this is no. Adobe does not need to focus on AI scene detection, mostly because I don't even think most people use AI scene detection on their existing phones, and there's no point of having AI scene detection if your phone can already take really great photos. AI scene detection is meant to enhance your photo, but you kind of don't need it if it's more destructive than it is enhancing. We've seen that AI scene detection can be bad when done poorly, but it can also be really good when done right, like on the P30 Pro, which already has great cameras. The thing is, as much as I like AI scene detection, it's more often a gimmick than it is a feature, just because there's a lot of times where things can go wrong and the photos turn out bad. I personally don't think that Master AI on the Huawei P30 Pro is a gimmick, because I do like the adjustments it makes, but you might not think that. You might think that since cheap phones use AI, which is a buzzword, make bad adjustments, and you wouldn't want this AI to ruin your photo even if you did have a flagship phone. I think this association is what killed AI scene detection for both markets, but is it even really that bad? I don't think so, because I like the way Huawei phones make adjustments to the photos, where those adjustments are actually meaningful, unlike the Poco phone. And I think this sort of computational photography might be the answer into making photos better. A good AI will look at a photo of some fruit and say, oh, this is oranges, and this is how oranges should naturally look like. And oh, this is some strawberries, and this is how the reds should look like. But the way most AIs work is they see a frame of the fruit and say, oh, this is an orange, and I should saturate the orange so that it looks fresher, rather than thinking about whether these adjustments are actually good for what we see in a real life perspective. So by making the orange more saturated, it actually changes how we perceive the orange, because now the saturation of the orange kind of has an artistic and creative style to it, because it's not that really realistic to what we see. And because of this, if we wanted a realistic looking photo, then we would have just turned off AI scene detection so that the AI can't make any adjustments to our photos. So the AI brings new life and perspective to your photos by making it look cinematic and vibrant, and it's supposed to impress you. I think a good white balance should come first before any AI adjustments, just so that the off-white balance won't be influencing the decisions made by the AI. But even so, whether you have a cheap phone or an expensive phone, off-white balance will always be an issue. But yeah, just something worth bringing up. The AI certainly impresses me that it's able to recognize the scene and make the photo better in some way, whatever way, but that's not for everyone. Maybe this is why something like the Google Pixel phones don't have AI scene detection, because their cameras are about realism than it is about giving you artistic styles. However, the Photoshop camera app, which I mentioned in my last video, is about art because of how much artistic style and value you can get out of your photos. So much art that it's more impactful than it is how the art presentation you get with some AI adjustments on some AI camera phones. The Photoshop camera app is a really good camera app that I think rivals the functionality behind AI scene detection in general, even though this app doesn't have any scene detection. The reason I think it rivals AI scene detection is because instead of letting master AI recognize the scene and then making adjustments, Photoshop Camera lets you make those adjustments yourself. The Photoshop Camera app has filters for something like food, and it changes up how your food looks. But if you want to make a filter for something else, then you can make your own filter so that you apply whatever you want these photos to look like. So if you want to enhance how your food looks, you can either make a filter yourself or just download filters made by other people. This ability gives the app a lot of potential because let's say you wanted to take a picture of your German Shepherd dog. Instead of letting Master AI do the recognition of, oh, you have a dog, you could instead just download or make a filter that is specific for German Shepherd dogs. It just gives the user a lot more control and knowledge about how this filter is going to alter their photo through whatever enhancements or changes or adjustments that this filter is designed to do. To end off the video, I think Master AI on the P30 Pro is really cool because it's impressive to see that the phone recognizes a scene and it's enhancing the image through its image database of how do I make this photo better. But sometimes it's time to turn off AI scene detection and let the real professionals take care of what's best for our photos. We are those professionals. If you enjoyed this review, then please give me a like. Didn't like what you see? Well, my Master AI scene detection already recognized that you are the kind of person to dislike this video. But yeah, if you did like what you see, please like, comment, and subscribe. Oh look, wow, another shirt with my name on it that says subscribe. I think that's for a reason. And yeah, I got plenty more computational photography and photography videos overall planned, so I think you'll like those too. So stay tuned for whenever those ideas start developing. And yeah, thank you for watching. This video was actually pretty important to me because I think Master AI is pretty cool and has a lot of potential, but I honestly don't know what people think about Master AI. So if you've used any sort of AI scene detection before, let me know in the comments down below, because I really want to know if you have it turned on or turned off, because for me it's always been turned on. I've never really turned it off. So again, that's personal preference, so you know. But yeah, thank you for watching, and bye bye.